The beast broke free, then guarded the human student like its own. Part 1. The alarm had been screaming for 3 minutes before anyone on level 4 noticed the cage was empty. Nora Caldwell dropped her clipboard the moment the red emergency lights flooded the corridor. She had been in the east wing of the Halcyon Research Center since 6 in the morning, alone, because that was how thesis research worked. Quiet hours, cold coffee, and a hallway that smelled like antiseptic and something older, something animal that no ventilation system had ever fully cleared out. The empty cage was not supposed to be possible. Containment Unit 7 had reinforced alloy walls 4 inches thick, a pressure-sealed door, and a lock system that required 2 senior researchers and a physical key to open from the outside. There was no mechanism to open it from the inside. The designers had been very deliberate about that, which meant something had found a way anyway. Nora pressed herself against the wall as the overhead lights shifted entirely to emergency red. She could hear boots on the floor above her, security personnel, moving fast and not quietly. She could hear Director Felix Harrow's voice crackle through the facility intercom, clipped and barely controlled at the edges. All non-essential staff evacuate to the surface immediately. All security teams report to Sublevel 2. Subject designation Crath 1. Treat as maximum threat. Do not engage without direct authorization. Nora was non-essential staff. She grabbed her bag and turned toward the evacuation stairwell at the end of the corridor. The stairwell door was sealed. The power surge that had cut the main lights had locked every magnetic reinforced door in the sublevel. She pulled the handle twice, then stopped, because pulling harder was not going to change physics. She ran her access card through the emergency panel beside the door. The panel blinked red. She ran it again, red again. She was locked in. Something moved in the dark section of the corridor ahead of her. Not a small movement, not a ventilation draft, not settling pipes. Something large shifted its weight in the darkness, and the sound of it was like a boulder adjusting on gravel. Nora stopped breathing. She pressed her back flat against the wall and looked into the dark end of the corridor. 2 eyes opened in the blackness. They were amber, wide, and they caught the emergency red light and reflected it back at her like 2 burning coins suspended in nothing. Crath 1 stood 7 feet at the shoulder when it moved on all 4 limbs. Its body was built the way a tank is built, nothing decorative, nothing wasted, everything load-bearing and purposeful. Its hide was deep charcoal gray, layered in overlapping plates the way armor is layered, and where the red light touched its surface, the material seemed to absorb the color and release it slowly, the way cooling metal behaves in dim light. Its head was broad and low, the jaw thick enough to suggest what it could do with it, the ears flat against the skull. 3 parallel ridges ran from its brow to the back of its neck, raised and dark, and the whole shape of it, even standing still, communicated something that bypassed language entirely and went straight to the older parts of the brain. The facility had held it in that cage for 6 years. 6 years of glass panels and feeding schedules and researchers with clipboards who wrote things down and never quite looked it in the eye. 6 years of being studied. It looked at Nora, not the way a predator looks at prey, not with hunger or calculation about distance. It looked at her the way something looks at a thing it has been watching carefully for a long time and has finally decided to approach. It took 1 step forward, then stopped. Its nostrils flared. It was reading the air the way a predator does, cataloging everything in the environment. Her heartbeat, her temperature, the specific chemical composition of someone who was frightened and holding completely still. It took another step. Nora made herself look directly at it. Not because she was fearless. Her hands were shaking and she was aware of this. But because she had spent 8 months studying this creature through reinforced glass, reading every behavioral report ever filed on it in the facility archive, and she knew from the data and from the hours of observation footage that Crath 1 had never once initiated an attack without a clear, documented provocation signal from the target. She gave it no provocation signal. She stood still. She breathed slowly and deliberately, because breathing slowly was the only thing she could control right now, and she used what she had. The creature stopped 2 meters in front of her. At this distance she could hear it breathe, slow and deep, a sound like a bellows working in a furnace room somewhere far below. She could see the rhythm of its ridges, rising and settling in a pattern that 8 months of observation had taught her was associated with low arousal states. Not aggression. Assessment. Its head lowered slowly until its eyes were level with hers. At this distance, the amber irises had depth, layers inside layers, like something geological, like something that had been looking at the world for a very long time and had accumulated the looking inside it. It exhaled. Warm air moved across her face. It smelled like stone that has been sitting in sunlight all day. Then it turned its back to her. It positioned itself between her and the dark end of the corridor, the direction it had come from, and it lowered its body into a wide, grounded stance. Shoulders squared toward the darkness ahead, head up and alert, every ridge along its spine fully extended. It was not threatening her. It was guarding her. From something still back there in the dark that it had already identified, and she had not. Nora heard it then. Footsteps. Multiple, fast, poorly coordinated. Not the measured double time of security boots. These were frantic, stumbling, the sound of people who had been running for longer than was comfortable and had not slowed down because slowing down had not seemed like a safe option. 3 researchers burst around the corner from the connecting corridor. Owen Briggs, a senior lab technician with 11 years at Halcyon, and 2 others Nora recognized from Sublevel 3. They skidded to a stop the instant they saw the Krath. Owen's face went the color of paper. The Krath did not move. It held its position exactly, did not turn toward the new arrivals, did not alter its stance. Owen looked at Nora. He looked at the creature. He looked at the 2 meters of corridor between them that the creature had not closed. "Caldwell," he said, very quietly as though volume might change something. "Do not move." "I know," she said. "It is right in front of you." "I know." "Why is it not?" "Guarding me," she said. "It is guarding me." Owen stared at her. His mouth opened and closed once. Behind him, the 2 researchers pressed themselves against the far wall and went completely rigid, watching the Krath with the specific stillness of people who had decided that breathing too loudly might be a mistake. The creature had not looked away from the dark end of the corridor once since it turned. Whatever had sent those 3 people running was still coming. Part 2. The thing coming from the corridor was not another creature. It was smoke. It rolled in low and gray along the floor tiles, thicker than it had any right to be, carrying the sharp chemical bite of burning insulation and scorched wiring, and something underneath both of those that Nora's brain cataloged automatically as a smell associated with things that were not supposed to be on fire. The power surge had done something to the facility's electrical systems, something that had started a fire in the walls, behind the control panels, in the spaces that maintenance workers checked twice a year on a schedule and forgot about during the months in between. Owen pressed the back of his hand over his mouth. "The East Junction," he said. "The junction overloaded. There is a fire in the wall conduit between sections C and D." Nora looked at the smoke layer spreading steadily across the floor. The sublevel had no windows. The evacuation stairwell was sealed. The ventilation system had shut down with the power surge, which meant the smoke had nowhere to move except outward and upward into corridors that were already sealed. And here was a locked section of the facility with 6 people, and a 900-kilogram creature that had not been outside its containment unit in 6 years. The Krath moved. It turned its head and looked at the corridor to the left, not the smoke corridor, not the sealed stairwell door. A narrow maintenance access passage set into the wall on the left side, marked with yellow hazard tape that had been there long enough to fade. That Nora had walked past approximately 50 times without giving it any real attention because it was narrow and led, as far as she had ever considered, to something mechanical and unimportant. The Krath looked at the passage, then it looked at Nora. She had read every behavioral report filed on Krath-1 in the 6 years since its arrival at Halcyon. She had spent 8 months in the observation room on the other side of the containment glass, 3 mornings a week, taking notes on its behavior for her thesis research. In those 8 months, she had learned things about the creature that had not made it into any official documentation, because they were the kind of observations that did not fit neatly into a research template designed for animals, and not for whatever this was. She knew, for example, that it tracked every exit in a room the moment a new person entered. She knew it watched the ventilation grates along the ceiling more than it watched the researchers. She knew it paid more sustained attention to the sounds the facility made, pressure shifts in the pipes, the behavior of the electrical systems under load, the hum of the containment units on either side of its own, than it paid to the people standing directly in front of it with clipboards. It had been listening to this building for 6 years, cataloging it, learning every corridor, every conduit, every point of weakness and every route of access through a wall of glass and the patience of something that understood the value of waiting. "The maintenance passage," Nora said. Owen looked at it. "That leads to the service substation. It is a dead end in practical terms." "Does it have a magnetic lock on the door?" He thought for a moment. "No, it is not a secured access point, just a corridor." "Then the power surge did not seal it," she said, "and it does not have smoke yet." The Krath was already moving toward it. Owen looked like a man being asked to follow an apex predator into a narrow corridor that barely fit the apex predator, which was precisely what he was being asked to do. The 2 other researchers, a lab technician named Lena Cross, who Nora knew slightly from the break room, and a materials analyst named Eli Marsh, who she knew only by sight, exchanged one look with each other. It was the look of 2 people rapidly calculating which option represented the greater immediate danger. The smoke resolved the calculation for all of them. It was thickening quickly, rolling forward at floor level, and somewhere deeper in the east wing something cracked and hissed in a way that suggested the fire had located a new material and was satisfied with the discovery. "Move," Nora said. She did not raise her voice. She said it the way her thesis advisor said it when a student was spending too long being uncertain about a step that was already clear. They moved. The Krath entered the maintenance passage first. Its body barely cleared the width of the corridor, the ridges along its spine scraping marks into the ceiling panels as it went, and it did not slow down for this. It moved without hesitation, no pausing at the entrance, no checking the space before committing. It knew where it was going. It had already chosen this route before any of them had thought to look at the passage, which meant it had identified the route before the fire and before the smoke. And that was a fact Nora stored away in the part of her mind that was still processing, even as the rest of her was simply moving. She followed directly behind it. She did not deliberate about this. She made the decision the way you make a decision when the alternative is standing still in a corridor that is filling with smoke, and the thing ahead of you has placed itself between you and every threat it has encountered since this started. The passage was cold and narrow and smelled like metal and undisturbed dust. Emergency strip lights ran along the base of the walls, casting pale green light that made everything look slightly underwater. The Krath moved through it like a wall that had learned to walk, and she could hear its breathing ahead of her, steady and measured, the breathing of something that was not afraid of where it was going. Behind her, Owen was moving fast and murmuring something under his breath. Lena and Eli were close behind him. All of them were moving quickly because the smoke had already begun to creep into the passage entrance behind them. The Krath stopped. Nora nearly walked into it. She caught herself with one hand flat against its flank. The hide was warm and solid and unyielding, exactly like pressing a palm against stone that has been sitting in afternoon sun, and she looked past its shoulder at what had caused it to stop. A security officer stood at the far end of the passage. Uniform pressed, pulse rifle raised at shoulder height. He was young. She could see that even at this distance in the green emergency light, and the rifle was not entirely steady in his grip. "Containment team, I have eyes on Crath 1 at the sublevel junction maintenance access," he said into the radio on his shoulder. His voice had a slight break in it. "Requesting authorization to neutralize." The Crath held its position in the center of the passage. Its ridges rose slowly, one by one, until they were fully extended. "Do not do that," Nora said. The officer looked past the Crath at her. He was perhaps 23, with the expression of someone who had run through this scenario many times in training simulations, and was discovering in real time that the simulations had not been built to the correct scale. His name tag said Cooper. "Ms. Caldwell." "A pulse round," she said, "discharged in an enclosed passage with active fire in the adjacent wall systems and elevated ambient temperature from smoke buildup, will have a very different result than it would in open conditions. I need you to understand that before you make a decision." "Thermal expansion," Owen said from behind her. "The pressurized propellant in that round at this temperature, in a sealed corridor." "I understand," Cooper said. He lowered the rifle 2 inches, not all the way, exactly 2 inches. "The creature needs to return to containment immediately," he said. "Its containment unit is in the section that is currently on fire," Nora said. "And it is the reason that the 4 people behind me are not still standing in that corridor right now. Before any authorization is given for anything, I need an officer with senior rank on this channel." She kept her hand flat against the Crath's flank as she spoke. Open palm, deliberate contact, the same gesture she had made against the observation glass 3 mornings a week for 8 months, each time wondering whether it registered on the other side. The creature's ridges dropped, not fully, halfway. Cooper watched this and went very still. He watched the ridges for a moment the way you watch something you have just seen that does not match the information you were given. "What did it just do?" he said. "It decided to wait," Nora said. Cooper looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached up and changed the channel on his radio to request a senior officer to the sublevel junction. The Crath had not looked away from Cooper once, but it had not moved forward. Nora could feel through her palm the slow and even expansion of its breathing, controlled, patient, the breathing of something that understood that the current moment required stillness and had chosen to provide it. She understood, standing in that narrow green-lit corridor with smoke curling at the entrance behind them, that this creature had been practicing this kind of patience for 6 years. It had simply decided tonight to stop practicing it quietly and alone. Part 3. The senior officer who arrived 9 minutes later was Captain Ada Farley. She came with 4 additional officers in containment gear and a transport case that Nora recognized immediately, the large sedation delivery system used for the facility's heaviest research subjects, the kind that required 2 operators and delivered enough tranquilizer compound to drop something the size of the Crath in under 40 seconds. Nora stepped in front of the creature. She did not plan this. She did not calculate it. She saw the transport case and moved, and found herself standing between it and the Crath before any deliberate decision had been made, which told her something about how the decision had actually been made. Captain Farley stopped 3 meters away. She looked at Nora, at the Crath behind her, and at the officers flanking her who had raised their rifles and then paused, uncertain. "Ms. Caldwell," Farley said. Her voice was level and had no edges in it. "Step aside. I need you to look at what this creature has actually done in the past 30 minutes, Nora said. Not what your briefing document told you it might do, what it has done." It breached a maximum containment unit, Farley said. That is what it has done. It then positioned itself between 4 researchers and a smoke-filled corridor. It navigated us through a maintenance passage it had no documented access to, which means it had mapped that route independently through 6 years of passive environmental observation. It has not made a single aggressive movement toward any person in this building tonight. Nora kept her voice flat and factual because flat and factual was the only register Farley was going to respond to. Captain. When a contained research subject's behavior does not match the stated threat profile, what does your training require? A short silence. Reassessment, Farley said. Then reassess. The craft had not moved during any of this exchange. It stood exactly where it had settled when Officer Cooper stepped aside, watching, ridges at half extension. Owen Briggs stepped up beside Nora. She had not expected this. He was a senior lab technician who had spent 11 years at Halcyon, following the protocol that the protocol prescribed, and standing beside a graduate student who was arguing with a security captain was not the protocol. I can pull the behavioral observation archive for the past 8 months, he said to Farley. Ms. Caldwell's thesis documentation. It contains data on this animal that is not present in any official facility report. Farley looked at him. What kind of data? The kind that indicates it has been learning this facility's layout, its systems, its structural vulnerabilities, and its staffing patterns in a systematic and deliberate way over an extended period. He paused for a moment. That is not animal behavior. That is planning behavior. This settled into the corridor differently than anything else that had been said. Lena Cross pressed her back against the wall. Eli Marsh looked at the craft the way you look at something when the category you had placed it in turns out to be the wrong category. Farley was quiet for a moment that was slightly too long to be a thinking pause and slightly too short to be hesitation. Planning toward what outcome? We did not know, Nora said, until tonight. She let that sit. The fire, Farley said. Our system diagnostics are showing ignition at the East Junction Control Board, the board that regulates power to the sublevel containment units. She looked at Nora directly. The burn pattern is not consistent with a mechanical failure. The analysis suggests sustained, repeated contact with the external panel surface from the adjacent side, directional and targeted. She paused. Crathwane's containment unit shares a wall with the conduit housing that runs directly behind that control board. No one in the corridor spoke. The craft had pressed something, its body, its shoulder, one of its ridges, against the right point in the wall beside its cage, repeatedly over time, until the wiring behind it failed in precisely the way required to cut power to its own lock mechanism. It had not escaped because the system failed. It had identified the failure point and produced the failure deliberately. Nora turned and looked at the creature. It looked back at her. The amber irises with their deep, layered quality, the ridges at half extension, the expression, and she had stopped apologizing to herself for using that word, because after 8 months the word was accurate, of something waiting to see what conclusion she had reached. It planned to get out, she said quietly. And the moment it got out, it came directly to this sublevel, not to the surface, not to an exit, here. She thought about the certainty of its movement through the maintenance passage, the prepositioned stance before she had even heard the other researchers coming. It knew something was wrong before the alarms activated. Farley's radio crackled. The voice that came through was Director Harrow, and the words he delivered were not about the craft. Captain Farley, we have an unauthorized breach point in the north exterior composite wall, professional-grade cutting equipment. Security feed coverage in the archive wing went dark approximately 4 minutes before the power surge occurred. We have unaccounted personnel in the east section. A pause that carried its own weight. This was not an accident. The fire was deliberate. Nora heard this and felt the pieces arrange themselves into a shape she should have seen earlier. Someone had breached the facility exterior before the fire started. The fire and the power surge were the tools. Cut the power, seal the internal doors, drive staff into evacuation chaos. In the disorder of a full-scale emergency response, sections of the facility that were normally locked and monitored and occupied became temporarily navigable. The archive wing held 6 years of Krath behavioral data, genetic mapping, complete biological documentation, and environmental response analysis. Material that certain research institutions and private biological acquisition firms would pay a significant amount to access. But the archive data was locked under the Interspecies Research Accord. You could not legally publish it, license it, or sell it through any accountable channel. "They are not here for the data," Nora said. Farley looked at her. "The data cannot be used, but the creature itself is a different matter." Nora kept her voice steady. "Under salvage statutes derived from maritime acquisition law, a research subject physically removed from a compromised facility during a documented emergency situation exists in a legal gray space. If you can get it out of the building and off the registered research manifest during an active crisis event, it becomes a salvage claim," Owen said. His voice was quiet and deeply uncomfortable. "The research protections attached to a registered subject do not automatically follow the subject if removal occurs under emergency conditions, and the original institution cannot demonstrate." "Active custody," Farley finished. She was already moving, radio to her mouth. "All teams, priority redirect to the north exterior junction. We have an active extraction attempt in progress. Archive wing is the target location. Move now." The Krath stood up. All 4 limbs, full height, with a single motion that was both fluid and enormous. It had been crouching to navigate the passage ceiling, but now it raised itself to its full dimensions, and the ceiling strip lights rattled against the impact of its shoulder ridges. Every officer in the corridor took one involuntary step backward. This was not a trained response. It was an older one. The Krath looked at Nora. Not at Farley, not at the rifles, not at the transport case. At Nora with those layered amber eyes, and she understood it without needing data or documentation or a research template to frame it in. "It already knows," she said. "It knew before the radio confirmed it." She looked at Captain Farley. "Let it lead us there." Part 4. The north exterior wall of the Halcyon Research Center was 12 centimeters of reinforced composite rated for structural integrity under significant force. The breach point, when Farley's team reached the north side corridor, was a clean-cut arc through the material, precise, professional, done with equipment that cost more than most field teams carry, and implied the kind of operational planning that goes well beyond opportunistic theft. Whoever had come through that wall had done this before and had prepared for it carefully. They moved through sublevel 1 in a formation that Nora had not planned to be part of. Farley had initially been clear. Nora and the 3 other researchers were to remain in the maintenance passage until the north section was cleared. Nora had nodded at this instruction. Then the Krath had looked at her and taken 2 deliberate steps toward the north corridor and stopped, and the communication in that was not ambiguous. "It will not go without her," Owen had told Farley. He said it as a fact, not an opinion. Farley had looked at this situation for a measured 3 seconds. Then she had pulled a lightweight protective vest from one of her officers' equipment packs and handed it to Nora, and told her to stay directly behind the creature and follow every instruction given to her immediately and without discussion. Nora was doing exactly that. The Krath moved through the facility with a focus that was almost uncomfortable to watch. It was not the cautious movement of something navigating an unfamiliar environment. Every step landed with certainty. Every turn was anticipated before the corridor announced it. It was moving through a building it had committed to memory over years of listening to it from behind a wall of glass. Every air pressure shift, every sound signature. Every structural vibration that indicated weight or movement, or the particular way a door settles when it has been opened and left ajar. It stopped at the intersection of corridors B and C and went completely still. Farley's radio hissed. A forward team member, already positioned at the archive wing entrance, said in the careful, low voice of someone who needed to be heard but not heard by the wrong people, "Captain, 4 individuals inside the archive wing. Armed. They have the large specimen transport cases from storage bay 2 open on the floor. Equipment is already being loaded." Nora knew what those cases were. She had encountered them on her first week at Halcyon, during the facility orientation, in the storage bay where they sat in a row and took up more space than seemed reasonable. They were built to the specific dimensions of a creature the size of the Krath: reinforced walls, atmospheric control systems, sedation delivery lines built into the interior panels. You did not carry those cases through a hole in a wall unless you had prearranged transport outside large enough to receive them, and a destination already confirmed. "How are they armed?" Farley said quietly into the radio. "Pulse rifles on 3 of them. The 4th is carrying a sonic disruptor, large animal calibration setting." Nora understood what that meant immediately. A sonic disruptor calibrated for large animal nervous system disruption would override the Krath's voluntary motor control at sufficient range. It would drop the creature where it stood, and it would be unable to resist handling or loading. That was precisely why someone had carried one through a wall in the middle of the night. It was the one tool that made the rest of the plan executable. She looked at the Krath. It had not moved from its position at the intersection, but the quality of its stillness had changed. It was the stillness of something that had already finished deciding and was waiting for the moment to act on the decision. "It can hear them," Nora said. Farley looked at her quickly. "Its documented hearing range is approximately 4 times the human range at standard frequency. It can hear the equipment being handled. It can probably distinguish individual voices through the archive wall." Nora kept her voice barely above a breath. "It knew they were there before we reached this corridor." Farley processed this without visible reaction and used it. She reorganized her team into 2 units in under 30 seconds, explained the entry sequence to each group with economy and precision, and assigned positions. She told the Krath to hold at the intersection until her forward unit reached the archive wing's secondary entrance. The Krath moved before she finished the sentence. It went through the intersection at a speed that had no right to belong to something of that size. 900 kilograms covering 20 meters in a duration that Nora's mind refused to accurately measure. Low and fast, and completely silent for the first 4 strides in a way that defied the physics of its build. The corridor ahead opened into the archive wing entrance, and it went through the opening so quickly that by the time the 4 people inside had registered that the sound profile of the room had changed, the source of the change was already in the room with them. Nora heard one shout, sharp and short. Then the heavy structural sound of something with 900 kilograms of force behind it making contact with a fixed object. Farley sent her team through immediately. Nora went in with them. The archive wing was not a large room. Shelving units lined 3 walls. Workstations occupied the center. 4 open transport cases sat on the floor with equipment and documentation already loaded inside, and the lids were open and waiting. 3 of the 4 intruders were backed against the far shelving wall. The Krath stood in the center of the room between them and the cases, and the sound it was producing was not loud, but it carried a vibration that Nora could feel through the floor and up through the soles of her shoes and into the base of her spine. 3, there had been 4. The 4th was in the far corner of the room. The sonic disruptor was in both hands. He was not panicking. He was focused, his movements deliberate, his eyes fixed on the Krath as he moved through the calibration sequence with the efficiency of someone who had practiced this specific action. He was the youngest of the 4, shorter than the others, and he was clearly the one they had brought for exactly this moment. "Hands up, all of you," Farley called as her team entered. "Equipment down, do not move." The man with the disruptor did not put it down. He turned the device toward the craft and completed the calibration sequence. His finger moved to the activation point. Nora crossed the room in 3 strides and drove her shoulder into his arm. She was not built to overpower anyone, and she did not overpower him. She shifted his angle by approximately 40 degrees at the precise moment the disruptor discharged, which was all that was required. The sonic pulse hit the shelving unit to the craft's left. The shelving unit dropped with a sound like something very large failing all at once. The man turned toward Nora, startled, and found the craft already between them. It had crossed the distance between the center of the room and the corner in less time than the shelving unit took to finish falling, and it was not touching him. It was simply there, at a distance that erased the concept of personal space entirely, enormous and immediate, the ridges along its spine fully raised and pressing against the ceiling tiles above it. He dropped the disruptor. He did not drop it because Farley's team had reached him. He dropped it because the thing in front of him had crossed that room the moment a human being was in danger, not to attack, not out of aggression, but to place itself between the threat and the person being threatened. And the deliberate intelligence behind that choice was visible in a way that made the entire operation, the planning and the equipment and the vehicle waiting outside, feel suddenly and completely wrong in a way he could not immediately articulate. Farley's team secured all 4 intruders in under 2 minutes. The craft stood in the center of the archive wing and watched the process until every person was restrained and accounted for. Then it turned, with the slow and deliberate quality of something that has finished what it came to do, and it looked at Nora. She was breathing hard. Her shoulder ached where it had connected with the man's arm. She looked at the creature standing in front of her, massive and ash-colored, and watching her with those deep amber eyes that had been watching things carefully for 6 years, and felt something she did not have a clean word for. "Good," she said. She said it the way you say something when it is the only word that accurately covers the situation. Its ridges dropped to half. Captain Farley stood in the middle of the room and looked at Nora and then at the craft, and then at the 4 secured intruders and the open transport cases and the collapsed shelving unit. And she had the expression of a person assembling a report in their head that is going to be very long and contain several sections that are difficult to categorize. "I have never written a report like the one I am about to write," she said. "No," Nora agreed, "you have not." Part 5. Director Felix Harrow arrived in the archive wing 17 minutes after the intruders were secured. He was a tall man with close-cropped gray hair and the particular posture of someone who had spent 30 years managing things that most people preferred not to think about too directly. He took in the room in one sweep: the 4 restrained intruders, the open transport cases, the collapsed shelving unit, Nora, and the craft, and then he looked at Captain Farley. "Report," he said. Farley gave it to him in clean, sequential order: the deliberate exterior breach, the power surge that was not a mechanical malfunction, the fire as a tactical distraction, the extraction attempt and its intended target, the craft's role at each stage of the response. She was precise and economical and did not insert her own interpretation into any of it, which Nora respected. Harrow listened to all of it without interrupting. When Farley finished, he looked at the craft for a sustained moment. The craft looked back at him. It had settled into a resting stance since the intruders were secured, weight distributed, ridges at low extension, the slow and even breathing of something that had done what it needed to do and was no longer in an active state. It regarded Harrow the way it regarded most things, with attention that was patient and measuring, and gave away very little about what it concluded. "It will need to return to containment," Harrow said. "Its primary unit is in the fire-damaged section," Nora said. "The structural assessment has not been completed." A temporary unit is being prepared on sublevel 3. It will meet the necessary standards until the primary unit is restored and cleared. He looked at Nora with the expression of a man who was not accustomed to being redirected and was choosing to be patient about it tonight specifically. The research protocols exist for documented reasons, Ms. Caldwell. The safety frameworks. The safety frameworks, she said, were designed for an organism with instinct-level cognition and behavioral responses below the threshold of deliberate planning. They were not designed for what is actually in this room. She opened her bag and pulled out the notebook she had been carrying for 8 months, battered at the spine, the cover soft with handling, handwritten notes dense on every page in her compressed and slightly tilted script. I need you to look at this before any decision is made. She held it out. He took it. He looked at the first page. He turned to the second, then the third. He stopped on a page approximately 1/3 of the way through. These are exit monitoring logs, he said. It tracked every entrance and exit point in its observation range and recorded, in the sense of behavioral repetition that I could document, the access patterns of facility personnel over an 8-month period. She kept her voice even. It identified which staff members accessed which sections on which days, at which intervals. It identified the maintenance rotation for the power conduit systems. It located the specific junction point that, if disrupted in the right way, would cut power to its own lock. And then it waited. She paused. Not because it was not capable of acting sooner, because the staffing rotation on Tuesday and Thursday mornings reduces human presence on sublevel 4 to the minimum. Today is Thursday. It chose today specifically. Harrow turned more pages. He stopped again. Communication attempt documentation, he said. Yes. You are recording what appear to be deliberate signals. Body orientation relative to the observation glass. Repeated behavioral sequences with objects in its environment that do not correspond to any stress or foraging pattern. Vocalization patterns outside the documented distress and alert ranges. Something else. Something I could not categorize with the existing research templates because the existing templates do not have a category for it. She held his gaze. It has been attempting to communicate for 6 years. We have been recording its sleep patterns and food consumption. Harrow closed the notebook. He looked at the craft for a long time. Owen spoke from his position near the workstations. He spoke quietly, the way you speak when you are saying something you have been assembling for a while and are now certain of. It did not go toward an exit when it got free, Director. It came to this sublevel, to the section where Ms. Caldwell works. It knew where she would be at this hour on this day, because it had been observing her schedule for 8 months. Harrow looked at Nora. Why her specifically? She thought about this before answering, not because she did not know, but because she wanted to say it accurately. I talked to it, she said. Every observation session for 8 months, not structured research communication, just talking, about my thesis progress, about what I was working through, about whatever was in my head on a given morning. I filled the observation room with a normal human voice because research spaces are quiet in a way I find difficult, and because, she stopped for a moment, because it listened differently when I spoke. Not to the sound, to me. Its orientation shifted. The quality of its attention shifted. It was not hearing noise. It was receiving something. Harrow was very still. It registered being spoken to as though it mattered, she said, and it remembered. The craft crossed the room toward her. It moved the way it had moved every time tonight when it was not responding to an immediate threat, slowly, with the deliberate care of something covering a distance in a way that does not want to alarm what it is approaching. It stopped beside her, not behind her, not in front of her, beside her, at the position that in any group of social creatures indicates a specific kind of alignment. Owen let out a slow breath. Lena Cross, who had not spoken in 30 minutes, said nothing but looked at the floor. Harrow looked at Nora, and at the creature beside her, and at the notebook in his hands, and at the 4 intruders who had arrived with a vehicle and transport cases, and a plan built on the assumption that the creature in Containment Unit 7 was a large and manageable specimen that could be loaded and removed. He looked at all of this for a long moment. "The temporary unit on sublevel 3, he said. "It is not configured for a research subject at this classification level." "No," Farley confirmed. "Reconfiguration to meet the necessary standards will take a significant amount of time. Weeks, at minimum." "At least that." "During that period, standard containment research protocols are suspended by default." He looked at Nora. "A subject in transitional housing requires a designated primary observer with an established behavioral baseline and documented observational history, someone already known to the subject, with a record demonstrating consistent contact." He set her notebook on the nearest workstation with a careful, deliberate motion. "Your thesis. Current status." "Final draft review stage," she said. "Submit it by tomorrow morning. Come to my office on Monday. We will formalize a research position, credentialed, structured with appropriate oversight, and a research team assigned to support it." He looked at the Krath one more time. The creature regarded him with its layered amber eyes. Harrow had the look of someone who had just discovered that a category he had been using for a long time was built on an incomplete foundation and was beginning the process of rebuilding it. "In the meantime, I need to contact the Interspecies Research Board, the facility legal team, and the security authority that handles unauthorized extraction attempts." He picked up his radio and walked toward the exit. In that order. He walked out. Nora stood in the archive wing. The Krath was beside her. Owen sat on the edge of a workstation with his hands folded and his eyes on the floor, thinking through something he would probably not finish thinking through tonight. Farley was organizing the extraction of the intruders with the efficient, unhurried manner of someone who has closed the active part of a situation and is now managing the paperwork of it. The facility was quiet. Somewhere above them, the fire suppression team had contained the blaze in the East Junction conduit. The emergency lights were still running, red shifting to amber as systems came partially back online. And in that amber light, the archive wing looked softer than it had any right to look given what had happened in it tonight. Nora reached out and pressed her open palm flat against the Krath's shoulder. The same gesture. The one she had made through the glass 100 times over 8 months, not knowing if it crossed whatever distance existed between one kind of mind and another. The creature did not move away. It settled slightly under her hand, a slow downward shift of weight, like something finally resting, and the ridges along its spine lowered all the way to flat for the first time since the alarm had started screaming hours ago. She stood there with her hand on its shoulder and thought about 6 years of glass, and what it costs to wait that long for something to change, and what it means to choose, when the moment finally comes, to go not toward freedom in the abstract but toward the one specific thing that made the waiting bearable. Outside the north wall, in the pre-dawn dark, a vehicle sat near the breach point waiting for a cargo that was never going to arrive. Inside, in the amber light of the archive wing, a graduate student who had not yet submitted her thesis stood beside a creature that had spent 6 years learning how to reach her. Neither of them needed to say anything. The work of getting here had already been done.